The Albanese Labor government and its Labor mates in Victoria and New South Wales have failed you in their most basic responsibilities. They've abused your trust. They do not take seriously their solemn obligation to keep you safe and to protect the freedoms and values of this country. Because once more, on the streets of Sydney and Melbourne on the weekend, they allowed some people to openly support listed Islamist terrorists and terrorist organisations without sanction. This is the preaching of hatred and division on our streets. The flags of Hezbollah were on display and some chanters in Melbourne shouted allegiance to the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, killed in an Israeli bunker bomb attack on Saturday, hailed as a martyr by Islamist extremists. This is the celebration on our streets of sectarian violence, of the murder of Jews and any others that the Islamist extremists consider as infidels. And nobody, not one person, was arrested. This is abhorrent to most Australians. It spits in the face of all we stand for as a nation. And incredibly, almost a year after October the 7th, Anthony Albanese is still pathetic, still sounding like a spectator.
We have continued to call for a de-escalation of that conflict in the Middle East. At the same time, we've seen worrying signs over the weekend. We do not want people to bring radical ideologies and conflict here. Our multiculturalism and social cohesion cannot be taken for granted, and it's important that we continue to stress that is the case as we go forward as well.
What? We don't want to see this, we don't want to see that. Is this some punter looking on from a park bench or watching events on TV? Or is this the Prime Minister of the nation, the bloke who has seen this happen since October the 8th last year and done absolutely nothing about it? I simply cannot abide this. This is our country going down the toilet, and this bloke is culpable. The Prime Minister is unforgivably negligent. Here's what happened 51 weeks ago in Sydney, just the day after 1,200 Israelis were slaughtered with the most unimaginable savagery and 250 were taken hostage.
I'm smiling and I'm happy. I'm elated. It's a day of courage.
And the very next night, we saw this abomination at the Opera House. Now, that turned out to be just the start. As you know, there were more protests, more threats, intimidating forays into Jewish neighbourhoods in Sydney and in Melbourne. And Albanese did nothing. He's allowed all this to fester. In fact, worse than nothing, Albanese and his government have continually criticised Israel. They've blamed the victim and they've weakened Australia's support for Israel, and they've abandoned Jewish Australians by constantly equating their very real fears to some imagined problem of Islamophobia. This is the ripping up of our social compact in this country before our very eyes. This is the demonisation of one group of Australians and threats against them by some members of another group. And governments, state and federal, have been standing back and doing nothing. I showed you just last week how the flag of Hezbollah was being paraded on our streets in a Sydney protest. I was outraged. I highlighted it. We followed up with the federal police, but nothing happened. The media ignored it. The governments ignored it. And now they all express surprise when we saw Hezbollah celebrated again at rallies in Melbourne and Sydney a few days later. This shows how the politicians are culpable. They need to direct the police on this stuff or change the laws if needs be and be proactive in what they say. But instead they avert their eyes and the problem just gets worse. And then the Home Affairs Minister offers up this statement yesterday. Any indication of support for a terrorist organisation is unequivocally condemned, said Tony Burke. It draws the immediate attention of our security agencies. There is a higher level of scrutiny if anyone is on a visa. I have made clear from day one that I will consider refusing and cancelling visas for anyone who seeks to incite discord in Australia. He's made clear? Burke has made nothing clear on this for almost a year. Nothing except his impotence on this issue, his unwillingness to call out the extremists, to condemn those demonising Israel and Jewish Australians. Burke and Labor have done nothing in a year and the problem is only getting worse. Where was Burke last week when we highlighted the Hezbollah symbols? Where was he last October after the celebrations in his own part of Sydney of a Hamas terrorist atrocity? Where was he after the Opera House chants disgraced our country and threatened Jewish Australians? Now he offers some mealy-mouthed formulaic condemnation. The opposition leader is onto him.
The law should be enforced, and I find it completely unacceptable that the government wouldn't be arresting people already or cancelling visas of people who are glorifying Hezbollah and Hamas and others. They have no place in our country. We're the greatest country in the world and we shouldn't be afraid to defend and protect it. And if Tony Burke continues to talk a big game, that's one thing, but he needs to follow through with it.
If ever we needed reminding, the events of the past year, the rising extremist element in these protests, it just proves that weakness is provocative. These are ugly and disturbing times. I walked right into that Melbourne protest with my family yesterday and I couldn't get out of there quickly enough. And of course, not everyone there is an extremist. And of course, most Australian Muslims are concerned for the Lebanese and Palestinian civilians in the Middle East, as we all are. And they'll be alarmed by the extreme elements in their own communities. But that doesn't mean we turn a blind eye to the extremists. Our governments, state and federal, have a prime obligation to keep us safe and to combat people and groups within our society that wish ill to this country and to other law-abiding people in this country. Open support for Islamist terrorist groups is a threat of violence. It is treasonous, it is vilification, and it should never be tolerated. But the Albanese Labor government and the state Labor governments in Victoria and New South Wales have done nothing. Seemingly desperate to avoid the risk of offending Muslim voters in key electorates, they've offered nothing but platitudes. Until today, woken by public outrage by the growing Hezbollah elements in the protests, they've suddenly started talking about police investigations and action.
It is utterly unacceptable. It is utterly unacceptable for anyone to be showing support for this proscribed terrorist organisation, and particularly to be doing this at a time when we know that communities here in Melbourne and Victoria are grieving as a consequence of the escalating conflict in the Middle East.
Look, I'll believe that when we see it, because most Australians have been horrified by this stuff for 51 weeks. The political leaders are at least 51 weeks behind what is right and what mainstream Australians instinctively understand. I'm deeply worried because in dangerous times we're being led by invertebrates. For this reason alone, Australian voters must get rid of the Albanese government next year. To leave it in power is just too big a risk for this country in dangerous times. We need governments that understand our values and the need to uphold them.